On November 12, 1940, Adolf Hitler signed Führer Directive No. 18. In that document, the leader of the Third Reich declared with a clarity that would later prove ironic that the participation of German forces in Africa should only be considered if the Italians managed to reach Mersa Matruh on the northern coast of Egypt. As long as that did not occur, Germany would remain detached from the African conflict. Hitler was concerned with something else. He had his eyes on the Soviet Union, but Italy had already made its own decision. On September 9, 1940, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani had begun his offensive from Libya toward Egypt with an army of 10 divisions. The initial advance was slow but real. They occupied Sidi Barrani within Egyptian territory, and there they stopped. Graziani expected reinforcements, better supplies, more armor. What he received instead was a devastating counterattack. On December 8, 1940, Operation Compass began, the British offensive launched by General Archibald Wavell with the Western Desert Force. It was a maneuver initially designed as a 5-day raid with limited objectives. What followed surpassed all Allied expectations. In less than 2 months, 3 British divisions, a total of about 31,000 men, 120 guns and 275 tanks, destroyed or captured 10 Italian divisions. The figures are striking: more than 130,000 prisoners, 400 tanks captured, more than 1,200 artillery pieces. Tobruk fell on January 22, 1941. Benghazi did so on February 6th. At the wasteland of Beda Fom on February 7th, the bulk of the Italian army in Cyrenaica ceased to exist as a fighting force. It was in Benghazi where General Richard O'Connor, commander of the Western Desert Force, contemplated with astonishment the scope of his own victory. Alongside him, 6 Italian generals had been captured: Bersaglieri General Bignani, Artillery General Villanis, Engineer Corps General Negroni, Tank General Bardini, General Kona and his Chief of Staff, General Giuliano. "I had not seen so many Italians since the 1911 Delhi Durbar," O'Connor commented with dry irony. British soldiers were brimming with confidence. They believed that within weeks they would be in Tripoli. The news reached Berlin like a hammer blow. If the British took Tripoli, the entire North African coast would become an Allied base from which to threaten the southern flank of Europe. This would endanger Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union that Hitler planned to launch in the spring of 1941. The loss of Libya, in the words of the German High Command itself, could create a more direct threat on the European continent. The strategic equation had changed. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German Armed Forces High Command, urgently debated. The solution could not be to send a full army. Resources were committed to the Eastern Campaign. But neither was it possible to allow the total collapse of the African front. The decision was to send an expeditionary force at corps scale, strong enough to contain the British, small enough not to compromise other fronts. That corps would receive a name that would go down in history: Deutsches Afrika Korps, the German Afrika Korps. On January 11, 1941, the DAK was formally established, although some documents indicate February 19th as the official activation date under that specific name. In its first weeks, the unit was simply known as Befehlshaber der deutschen Truppen in Libyen, commander of German troops in Libya. Whatever the exact founding date, the structure was clear: a motorized corps-level unit initially composed of 2 major formations. The first was the 5th Light Division, hastily assembled from elements of the 3rd Panzer Division, in particular the 5th Panzer Regiment, drawn from the Berlin-Wunsdorf garrisons. The second was the 15th Panzer Division, which would arrive later in the spring of 1941. Neither had been specifically trained to fight in the desert. That would be the first of many improvisations of the Afrika Korps. Command of the expeditionary force fell to General Lieutenant Erwin Rommel. The choice was not obvious. Rommel was the most modern general in seniority to hold the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, a decoration that placed him as the second army officer to receive that distinction. He was 49 years old and had gained fame leading the 7th Panzer Division during the 1940 campaign in France, a unit that advanced so fast that the Germans themselves lost track of it on the map, earning it the nickname Ghost Division. He was aggressive, intuitive, despised paperwork, and had an almost instinctive ability to read terrain from a vehicle or from the air. He was in many ways the perfect man for a war of movement in the desert. In other ways, he was exactly the type of commander who could push his troops beyond what supplies and orders allowed. On February 11th, 1941, Rommel landed in Tripoli. The first contingents of the Daké had already been on the ground since the previous day. The city was a hub of demoralized Italians and Germans arriving in urgency. Rommel conducted his aerial reconnaissance that same afternoon, flying over in a small plane the front where the Italians had stopped. What he saw convinced him that action had to be taken quickly. His official orders were clear: remain on the defensive, await the arrival of the 15th Panzer Division, scheduled for late May, and only then, if circumstances allowed, launch limited attacks in the Ajdabiya region. Berlin and Rome had agreed on that cautious approach. General Italo Garibaldi, supreme Italian commander in North Africa and Rommel's superior, expected exactly that. What none of them expected was that Rommel would obey. On March 31st, 1941, at 9:44 in the morning, reconnaissance vehicles from the German 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, stationed at Mersa el Brega, collided with a forward patrol of the British 2nd Armoured Division. At 9:50, the first shells exploded. Operation Sonnenblume, Sunflower, had begun, and with it the history of the Afrika Korps in combat. But before that first shot, Rommel had already fought another battle, a battle of illusions and perception. He knew the DIAC was numerically inferior. The 5th Light Division had only about 120 tanks, many of them veteran Panzer I and Panzer II models with limited firepower, with only 40 Panzer III and 10 Panzer IV tanks fully combat capable. The British had more men, more artillery, and on paper, more tanks. To compensate for that difference, Rommel turned to psychology. He ordered anti-aircraft guns to be mounted on trucks and driven repeatedly along routes visible to British aircraft and intelligence. He had cardboard and wooden tank silhouettes built and painted grey-green, which from a distance or from the air could be mistaken for armoured vehicles. He organised circular marches of columns that raised clouds of dust visible for miles, giving the impression that new divisions were constantly arriving at the front. General Claude Auchinleck, who would later command British forces in Africa, would admit that these deception tactics delayed Allied decision-making by several crucial weeks. Meanwhile, Rommel used that borrowed time to reorganize the Italian units in the area. Colonel Gaston Gambara, who commanded the Italian Armored Corps, later recalled that Rommel did not simply give orders. He walked among Italian regiments, demanded exercises, reorganized procedures, and taught officers to think in terms of mobility and speed. The Italian troops, who had arrived demoralized after the disaster of Operation Compass, began to regain some discipline and cohesion. To strengthen troop morale, the Afrika Korps also launched its own field newspaper. It was called Die Oase, the Oasis. The first issue appeared in March 1941. Printed on rough grey paper, featuring accounts of individual exploits, barracks humour and frontline news. It was a deliberate attempt to create a shared identity. The soldiers of the DAK would not be merely Germans stationed in Africa. They would be the Desert Foxes, a community with its own mythology and honour. On March 31st, when Rommel launched his offensive without waiting for the 15th Panzer Division and without properly informing his Italian superiors, the situation on the British side was in some ways favourable for an attack. General Wavell had sent much of his best troops to Greece to reinforce that front, which was also on the verge of collapse. In Cyrenaica, only a weak force remained, the 2nd Armoured Division with a light tank brigade, a regiment equipped with 50 captured Italian tanks, and a 5th Regiment with about 50 cruiser tanks. Wavell and his staff also believed that the newly arrived German troops would not be capable of offensive operations until substantial reinforcements arrived. The MR6 intelligence report in Berlin confirmed this assessment. It was a mistaken judgment. The 5th Panzer Regiment from Berlin-Wunsdorf under Lieutenant Colonel Albrecht attacked Mersa el Brega that same morning on March 31st, supported by 2 Stuka airstrikes at 5:30 p.m. The infantry pushed through the dunes in 40-degree heat across minefields. The advance was slow but unstoppable. The British began to withdraw. Rommel, at the wheel of his command vehicle, positioned himself personally at the vanguard. In the following days, the German advance reached a speed that disconcerted everyone. On April 4th, DAC forces took Suez, where a huge British fuel depot exploded by mistake. The garrison destroyed it after mistaking the dust raised by retreating British tanks for a German advance. By mid-April, the Afrika Korps had advanced more than 800 kilometers, taken Benghazi on April 4th, captured the towns of Mekili and Derna, and even taken 2 front-line British generals prisoner. General Philip Neame, commander of forces in Cyrenaica, and General Richard O'Connor, the architect of the Operation Compass Victory, were travelling together in a staff vehicle along the Derna Road on the night of April 6th to 7th when they ran into a motorised patrol of Group Ponath. The driver tried to resist, picked up his rifle, but was cut down by a burst from a submachine gun. Neame and O'Connor, exhausted, surrendered under the guns of the German troops. It was an almost accidental capture, but of enormous symbolic value. The man who had destroyed 10 Italian divisions was now a prisoner of war. By late April, the Afrika Korps had laid siege to Tobruk, whose Australian garrison, the 9th Australian Division, about 14,000 men, refused to surrender. On the western edge of Egypt, forward DAK units had crossed the border and occupied Halfaya Pass and the town of Sollum. Rommel had covered more ground in less time than Berlin thought possible, and he had done so with a single division, without the 15th Panzer Division, defying his superiors' orders and the basic laws of logistics. General Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his diary on April 23, 1941, his frustration with Rommel. Rommel is not up to the situation. His operations are improvised without an overall plan. The only result is that the troops are scattered all over Cyrenaica. It was a valid criticism from a doctrinal point of view. But the maps told a different story. Meanwhile, Tobruk held out. The first German attempt to take the fortress on April 13th to 14th ended in failure. General Heinrich von Prittwitz und Gaffron, commander of the 15th Panzer Division, was killed by artillery fire on April 10th near kilometer marker 16, becoming the first DAK general to die in combat. Lieutenant Colonel Ponath, commanding the 8th Machine Gun Battalion, managed to penetrate the fortress perimeter with his men, but became trapped in close quarters fighting without the promised reinforcements. Ponath was killed in the chaos of trench warfare. His battalion was destroyed. Tobruk did not fall, and as long as the Australians held it, Rommel could not advance into Egypt. The port fortress was the key. Without it, German supply lines would continue stretching 1,500 kilometers from Tripoli to the front, with all the consequences in exhaustion, vulnerability, and fuel shortages. Tobruk was a scar, and for 8 months, between April and December 1941, the soldiers of the Afrika Korps lived with that scar open in their flank. The Allied garrison, Australians, New Zealanders, British troops from the 22nd Guards Brigade and South African artillery, clung to the 50-kilometer perimeter as if it were the last fortress of the free world. Because in a certain sense, it was. The heat in the positions near the perimeter reached 50 degrees Celsius during the day. The ground was limestone covered by a thin layer of dust. There was no shade, no trees, no relief. The soldiers of the 104th Artillery Regiment, who had arrived in April 1941 from the barracks of Baumholder, which they had left during a snowstorm, took only days to understand that Africa was another planet. Flies were, in the words of Lieutenant Friedel Schmidt, a greater enemy than all the armies of the world. They crawled into mouths and noses, covered food within seconds, and turned the wounded suffering into agony. Dysentery ravaged troops on both sides. And underground, Australian defensive bunkers built into solid rock and camouflaged at ground level were practically invisible until someone fell into them. The nights had their own terror. The Australians carried out silent night raids like predators, berets, wool sweaters, soft-soled shoes, grenades in their pockets and Thompson submachine guns in their hands. They would appear without warning inside German positions, empty their magazines and disappear before anyone could react. If they took prisoners, they said nothing. They only smiled. It was a kind of warfare for which the average German soldier had not been prepared. Captain Wilhelm Bach, a Protestant pastor turned battalion commander, became a legendary figure on that front. He commanded the 1st Battalion of the 104th Artillery Regiment and had taken command after his predecessor fell in the early days of the siege. The soldiers called him the Pastor, with a mixture of mockery and affection. Bach never ordered what he was not willing to do himself. At the positions of Wadi Kualala in 130-degree shade, Captain Bach would personally go out to observe enemy fire from the edge of the ravine, while shells from the Ratch Bum, as the Germans called the dangerous British 75mm anti-tank gun because of the sound it made, whistled just centimeters from his steel helmet. The British press would later call him the hero of Halfaya Pass and the pastor of hell. Halfaya Pass, located on the coastal escarpment separating the Libyan plateau from the shoreline, became the heart of the border battles. On May 26, 1941, the Herf Combat Group seized it from the British through a classic maneuver. The 8th Panzer Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Kramer advanced from Sollum to the south, turned north and attacked the pass from the rear, while the 5th Panzer Regiment launched a diversionary attack from the west and the infantry of the 15th Motorized Infantry Battalion attacked head-on. Colonel Herf coordinated the maneuver with precision. The pass fell in a single day. Inside the pass, German engineers installed 4 88mm anti-aircraft guns, the famous Flak 88s, in carefully camouflaged positions. Lieutenant Richter walked 150 meters forward and lay down on the ground to verify the camouflage. He saw nothing. The desert's constant haze and the depression of the positions below ground level made them practically invisible from land. Italian artillery under Major Pardi complemented the German positions on the flank. It was a trap. On June 15, 1941, Operation Battle Axe arrived, the British counter-offensive with tanks freshly shipped from Britain aboard the Tiger convoy. In total, the convoy had brought 135 Matilda II infantry tanks, 26.5 tons with 90mm of armor, and 82 Cruiser Mark II tanks, plus 21 Light Mark IV vehicles. Wavell telegraphed Churchill on May 25 that Tiger only needed to scratch to get going. Churchill named it with enthusiasm. The operation was meant to change the balance in the desert. It did not. At Halfaya Pass, the Matildas advanced directly into the firing lines of Lieutenant Richter's Flak 88s. The shells from those guns could reach 8,000 meters in the air. At ground combat range, they punched through Allied tank armor with total ease. The Matilda, whose armor had withstood all German light anti-tank guns, now burned like torches. British tanks were destroyed one after another. In regimental tradition, Halfaya Pass became known as Hellfire Pass. Battle Axe failed within 3 days. Wavell was removed from command. He was replaced by General Claude Auchinleck, who arrived from India with the intention of building a force large enough to expel the DAK from Cyrenaica once and for all. For that he needed time, and the siege of Tobruk was costing Rommel time as well. There is a popular image of the Afrika Korps as an elite force specifically trained for desert warfare, composed of hand-picked volunteers selected from the best of the German army. That image is a myth. Colonel Jesus Martinez de Merlon, Spanish military historian and professor at the Institute of Military History and Culture, explains it clearly. The German Corps is recruited from different units, especially initially from the 3rd Panzer Division, and there is no special recruitment of people prepared for the desert. The DK was built in haste from whatever was available. The basic structure of the Corps followed the standard Wehrmacht Army Corps model. The headquarters directed operational strategy, coordinating reconnaissance units, logistical detachments, signal companies, mapping units, and a hydraulic company, essential in an environment where water was a matter of life and death. To this were added heavy artillery, anti-tank units, and at various moments during the campaign, Italian and German paratrooper contingents. Tanks were the core of the DAK. The organization of a panzer battalion in 1941 reveals both its capabilities and its limitations. A typical battalion included a headquarters staff with 2 reconnaissance sections equipped with Panzer I and Panzer II, light vehicles essentially auxiliary with limited offensive capability. Each combat company also had its own reconnaissance section with Panzer IIs, but the real striking force was the Panzer III, 17 per company, equipped with a 50mm gun and capable of engaging most British tanks of the early campaign on equal terms. The 4th Company, equipped with the more powerful Panzer IV, carrying a short-barreled 75mm gun, only had 10 vehicles per battalion because no more were available. German production of that version was limited. In total, a German panzer battalion could theoretically field around 65 tanks, but fewer than 50 were truly effective anti-tank combat vehicles. The Panzer I, although included in the numbers, were vulnerable even to light anti-tank guns. This mixed composition explains why German columns often appeared more numerous in battle than they actually were. They advanced in formations that included all kinds of vehicles, creating an impression of strength that did not always match reality. The 88mm guns deserve special mention. Originally designed as anti-aircraft artillery, the Flak 88 had already proven in France that a shell capable of reaching a bomber at 8,000 meters could also pierce any known ground armor. Their systematic use as anti-tank weapons was, according to many historians, the most decisive tactical innovation of the Afrika Korps. At Halfaya, at Sollum, and in dozens of defensive positions across Egypt and Libya, the 88s turned Allied armored assaults into massacres. Matilda tanks, considered impenetrable before the North African campaign, burned after the first hit. The problem was not the tanks, it was fuel and distance. The DAK supply chain is perhaps the most misunderstood element of the entire campaign. Supplies arrived by sea from Italy to the ports of Tripoli, Benghazi, and occasionally Tobruk. From there, truck convoys had to travel up to 1,500 kilometers across sand roads or dusty tracks to reach the front. The fuel consumption of those trucks on the way was enormous. Out of every 100 liters leaving the port, sometimes fewer than 30 reached the front. Every kilometer Rommel advanced exponentially worsened the logistical burden. The Italian Navy, whose contribution to the war effort has been systematically underestimated, fulfilled its mission with considerable sacrifice. Records of convoys between 1941 and 1943 show that out of every 100 tons shipped from Italian ports to Africa, losses averaged around 13% in transit. Most ships, infantry and artillery reached their destination. The problem was not crossing the Mediterranean. It was the inland journey from ports to front lines, multiplied by tens of thousands of vehicles requiring fuel, ammunition, spare parts, water, food and medical supplies. Heat destroyed equipment. Fine silica sand penetrated engines, wearing down cylinders at a rate unmatched in Europe. A tank that could run 10,000 kilometers in Poland without major maintenance required a full overhaul every 1,500 kilometers in the desert. Radios failed, maps were incomplete, magnetic compasses were unreliable on rocky plateaus. Drivers and pilots had to navigate by sun and stars. The comes-in wind, carrying fine sand for days at a time, reduced visibility to zero and halted entire operations. And then there were the men. The average German recruit arriving in Tripoli in 1941 took weeks to adapt. The combination of extreme daytime heat, regularly exceeding 45 degrees Celsius, and the freezing desert nights, which could drop to 5 or 6 degrees Celsius before dawn, produced continuous physical stress. Dysentery was endemic. Infectious jaundice, the desert fever, incapacitated hundreds of men for weeks at a time. Rommel himself contracted intestinal illnesses repeatedly during the campaign, although his iron will kept him in the field. By late 1942, the general was physically exhausted. On August 18, 1941, at 21:57 Central European Time, a woman's voice came through the loudspeakers of Soldaten Sender Belgrade, Radio Belgrade for soldiers. The song that played was dark, sentimental, and faintly melancholic. It was called Lied eines jungen Wachposten, the song of a young sentry. No one would have bet a pfennig on its success. 2 years earlier, when it had first been recorded, it had sold barely 700 copies. The story of Lili Marleen is, in itself, a parable of war. The original poem had been written in 1915 by Hans Leip, a schoolteacher from Hamburg serving in the Imperial German Army during the First World War. He wrote it remembering two women, his girlfriend, named Lily, and the girlfriend of a comrade, named Marleen. He merged them into an imaginary figure waiting under the lamp outside the barracks. The poem remained dormant for 20 years until it was published in 1937 in a collection titled Die kleine Hafenorgel. In 1938, composer Norbert Schulze, already famous for operas, marches, and film propaganda scores, read the poem and set it to music. He gave it a simple, memorable melody with a rhythm that settled into memory effortlessly. The following year, his friend Lael Anderson, a cabaret singer born on March 23, 1905 in Bremerhaven, whose real name was Lieselotte Helene Bertha Bunnenberg, recorded the song on August 2, 1939 at the Electrola Studios in Berlin. She did so, she later said, with little enthusiasm. She disliked the melody. She thought it would be another failure. The record was released and sold only 700 copies. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda, dismissed the song as too sentimental, too melancholic, not martial enough. Then came the war, and with it, the German occupation of Yugoslavia in April 1941. Radio Belgrade was converted into Soldatensender Belgrad, the station serving German armed forces. Its signal was so powerful it could be heard across Europe and the entire Mediterranean basin. The station's director, Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Reintgen, was sent to Vienna to find second-hand records to fill the broadcast schedule. Among the recordings in the archives of the Reich radio station in Vienna, he found the old Lael Anderson record. He brought it back to Belgrade. On August 18, 1941, Reintgen played the song for the first time. The reaction was immediate. Within days, hundreds of letters arrived from every corner where German troops were stationed, requesting it be broadcast again. When Goebbels tried to ban it, pressure from soldiers was so strong that he had to reverse the decision. Lili Marleen began airing every night at 21:55, just before the end of transmission. It became the unofficial anthem of the African campaign. Field Marshal Rommel listened to it with his men. It is said that Rommel himself requested Radio Belgrade to make it a fixed part of the nightly schedule, the final signal of the day. For the soldiers of the DAK, buried in their positions before Tobruk or moving along the dusty tracks of Cyrenaica, that voice was a connection to a world on the other side of the Mediterranean, their homes, their cities, their families. What no one had anticipated was that British soldiers were listening as well. The Eighth Army tuned into Radio Belgrade as often as the Afrika Korps did. British officer and writer Fitzroy MacLean described the effect of the song in the spring of 1942 in the Western Desert. The voice reached him, hoarse, sensual, nostalgic, sweet as sugar, making him think of how long it had been since he had seen Europe. Allied command eventually banned officers from letting troops listen to it. The ban proved impossible to enforce. The melody was already in everyone's lips and whistles. The BBC produced a parody anti-German version in 1943, with new lyrics sung by Lucy Mannheim. The Allies recorded their own renditions. German-born actress Marlene Dietrich, exiled in Hollywood and a vocal opponent of Nazism, recorded it in both English and German for Allied troops. Vera Lynn sang it in English. The Spanish Blue Division sang it in Spanish. In 48 languages, the song of the girl under the street lamp crossed every border. After the war, Lael Anderson received a gold record certifying more than 1 million copies sold. Goebbels never liked it, but the war needed the song, and the song needed the war. When Lael Anderson was asked why it became so popular among soldiers on both sides, she answered with an image that said everything. Can the wind explain how it became a storm? On November 18, 1941, the British Eighth Army launched Operation Crusader. It was the largest offensive the Allies had attempted up to that point in the North African desert, and its objective was straightforward: lift the siege of Tobruk, destroy the Afrika Korps, and reconquer Cyrenaica. The new commander-in-chief, General Claude Auchinleck, Auchi as his men called him, had spent months reorganizing, re-equipping, and expanding his forces. The Eighth Army now consisted of two distinct corps: 30 Corps, which grouped the armored divisions, the 7th Armored Division with 3 armored brigades, and 13th Corps, which concentrated infantry units supported by infantry tank brigades. This separation between armour and infantry reflected British doctrine at the time, which distinguished between armoured brigade, intended for mobility and deep operations, and infantry tank brigades designed for direct infantry support against armoured counterattacks. This conceptual distinction would have significant consequences in combat. The offensive began in secrecy. Rain and sandstorms in the preceding days had kept the Luftwaffe grounded, and Allied concentration movements largely went unnoticed by German intelligence. Rommel, convinced that the British would need weeks to be ready for an attack, was planning his own final assault on Tobruk. Operation Crusader caught him by surprise. In the early days, British armour advanced rapidly toward the southern perimeter of Tobruk. The 7th Armoured Brigade, equipped with the new Crusader cruiser tanks, pushed towards Sidi Rezek, an elongated ridge overlooking the airfield south of Tobruk. There, the fiercest fighting began. The terrain around Sidi Rezek became the scene of chaotic engagements over several days, with armoured columns crossing paths in the dust, commanders losing contact with their units, and generals making decisions based on information hours out of date. The German panzer divisions responded with their characteristic speed. General Ludwig Cruel, who commanded the Afrika Korps under Rommel's supervision, coordinated the movements of the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions in a series of successive blows. At Sidi Rezeh on November 22nd, the 21st Panzer Division virtually destroyed the 4th Armoured Brigade and inflicted around 3,000 casualties on the South African Division. It seemed that the Allied offensive was on the verge of collapse. It was then that Rommel made a decision still debated by historians today. On November 24th, in a burst of offensive initiative that defied all defensive logic, he concentrated the bulk of his armoured forces, the Gruppe Rommel, composed of both panzer divisions, and launched them eastward toward the Egyptian frontier, aiming to cut Allied supply lines and cause panic in the rear. This was the so-called dash to the wire, the race to the frontier fence. The panic Rommel expected did not materialize. Auchinleck held firm, relieved General Cunningham, who had been commanding the 8th Army, and personally assumed command of operations, refusing to order a retreat. The New Zealanders, advancing along the coast toward Tobruk, made contact with the garrison on November 27th. Rommel had to turn back, leaving behind the divisions he had sent east, achieving little more than temporarily disrupting the Allied rear. When he returned to the main battlefield, he found that his tanks had suffered severe losses. The number of operational panzers had fallen to less than a quarter of their initial strength. The attempt to encircle and destroy the Afrika Korps had failed, but the attrition was unsustainable. On December 7, 1941, the same day Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and the United States entered the war, Rommel made the most painful decision of his African campaign. He ordered a withdrawal to the El Agheila line, exactly the point from which he had launched his first offensive 8 months earlier. The Italians, whose units had maintained the siege of Tobruk for months, were stunned. They had just regained Cyrenaica with enormous effort, and Rommel was sending them back to their starting point. The fury of Italian General Bastico, who had replaced Garibaldi as supreme commander in the African theatre, was immense. But Rommel held his ground. He preserved the structure of the army at the cost of territory. It was both a brilliant decision and a recognition of reality. The DAK could not survive if it spent its last tanks on static defense. The siege of Tobruk had lasted from April 10th to December 10th, 1941, 242 days. The garrison had resisted with unprecedented tenacity, suffering around 3,000 fatal casualties among all nationalities present. The Afrika Korps had paid a similar price during the siege, and Operation Crusader had cost it even more. For the first time since the beginning of the campaign, the balance of forces had turned against Rommel. On January 21, 1942, while the world was absorbed by the Pacific Front and the war in the East, Rommel struck again. No one expected it. The British had left only a single brigade at the front after withdrawing their main forces to reinforce other theatres, convinced that the DAK was out of action for months. Rommel, having received an initial convoy of tanks and fuel, attacked without even informing his Italian superiors. Within 2 weeks, the Afrika Korps had retaken Benghazi and pushed the British back to the Gazala line, about 70 kilometers west of Tobruk. It was then that the so-called Gazala line was formed, a 60-kilometer Allied defensive system stretching from the Mediterranean coast to the box of Bir Hakeim in the southern desert. The line consisted of a chain of fortified boxes, mined and heavily armed, separated by open spaces that were supposed to be controlled by armoured forces, in theory. During the first months of 1942, both sides received reinforcements. The British received the first American M3 Grant tanks, with a 75mm hull-mounted gun capable of engaging Panzer IVs on equal terms. The Germans received improved versions of the Panzer III and Panzer IV with longer-barreled guns. By May 1942, the Afrika Korps had around 320 German and Italian tanks, compared to more than 800 Allied tanks, although Allied armour was technically heterogeneous in quality. On May 27, 1942, Rommel launched the Battle of Gazala. The manoeuvre was typical of his style. While Italian-German infantry divisions feigned attacks against the centre of the Allied line, the bulk of the DAK armour, the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions, plus the 90th Light Division and the Italian Ariete Armoured Division, circled the southern end of the line through the desert during the night and struck the Allied rear at dawn on May 27th. At Bir Hakeim, the southern end of the line, a Free French brigade commanded by General Marie-Pierre Koenig held out for more than 2 weeks against Axis divisions, becoming one of the most heroic defences of the entire North African campaign. But the resistance at Bir Hakeim could not save the overall position. The British, who expected to exploit the flanks of the German advance with their tanks, instead encountered deep anti-tank formations. The panzers advanced, and when Allied tanks pursued them, the 88mm guns positioned in the rear destroyed them. The name of this tactic became famous: the Kesselschlacht, the Cauldron Battle. On June 21, 1942, Tobruk fell. The South African garrison of 33,000 men surrendered after less than a day of formal combat. It was the greatest disaster for British arms since the fall of Singapore. Churchill received the news in Washington, where he was meeting Roosevelt, and described the feeling as one of the heaviest blows I can recall during the war. In Tobruk's warehouses, the Afrika Korps captured fuel, ammunition, vehicles and supplies that would sustain the advance for weeks. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler promoted Rommel to Generalfeldmarschall Field Marshal. At 50 years old, Rommel became the youngest in the rank, the sixth in seniority among all German marshals. The road to Egypt was open. On June 30, 1942, the columns of the Afrika Korps were crossing the Egyptian frontier eastward. Rommel was advancing with fewer than 60 operational tanks and about 4,000 infantry with very limited fire support. Yet he was moving against an army that was running. Ahead of him, the 8th Army was retreating in disorder toward defensive positions around a small railway station called El Alamein, 106 kilometers west of Alexandria. The psychological impact of the fall of Tobruk and the advance of the DAK had been tremendous in Cairo. On July 2, 1942, it was called at British headquarters and at the embassy Ash Wednesday. For hours, staff frantically burned confidential documents in anticipation of the imminent capture of the city. Columns of black smoke could be seen from afar. Ships began to leave the port of Alexandria. Mussolini, inflamed with enthusiasm, flew from Rome to Libya to prepare his triumphant entry into Cairo on a white horse. A telegram intercepted by Allied intelligence revealed that the Duce had already chosen the stallion for the ceremony. Rommel's strategic conception was grand. Taking El Alamein meant crossing the Nile Delta, reaching the Suez Canal, and closing one of the 2 gateways to the eastern Mediterranean. With the canal in German hands and Gibraltar still not taken under threat, the British position in the Mediterranean would become untenable. It was also the first link in what some German strategists called the Caucasus pincer. If the forces of Operation Blue, launched in June 1942 on the Russian front, reached the oil fields of Iran and the Caucasus from the north, while the Afrika Korps did so from the south, the British Empire would be crushed between 2 jaws. It was a geopolitical dream of Napoleonic dimensions, and it was also, in the reality of July 1942, almost impossible. On July 1st, Rommel attacked the Allied positions at El Alamein with what he had. The First Battle of El Alamein lasted from July 1st to July 27th. In the first 2 weeks, the Afrika Korps broke through several Allied positions, captured thousands of prisoners and inflicted around 15,000 casualties on the 8th Army. Fear in Alexandria was palpable, but Rommel did not have enough. He did not have fuel for large maneuvers. He did not have infantry to exploit the breaches opened by his armored units. Supplies trickled in from Tripoli across a Mediterranean increasingly controlled by Allied air power operating from Malta. Auchinleck, who had personally assumed command of the 8th Army, relieving General Neil Ritchie, made a decision that proved to be the turning point, not to withdraw. He organized defenses in depth, taking advantage of the unique geography of El Alamein. To the north, the Mediterranean. To the south, the Katara Depression, an abyss of shifting sand 60 meters deep that made outflanking impossible. For the first time in the African campaign, the Afrika Korps could not maneuver freely. It was channeled into a 50-kilometer front with no possibility of encirclement. The First Battle of El Alamein ended in a stalemate of exhaustion. Both armies dug in. Rommel had suffered casualties he could not replace. His armoured strength had fallen below the minimum level for new offensives, and his own health was visibly deteriorating. In August 1942, Auchinleck was replaced. General Harold Alexander took command of the forces in the Middle East. For the Eighth Army, General William Gott, a veteran of armoured warfare and a man of experience and respect among his soldiers, was initially appointed. But Gott died on August 7th when his plane was shot down by the Luftwaffe over the desert. His replacement was a short general with peculiar manners who initially provoked laughter among the troops. His name was Bernard Law Montgomery. General Bernard Law Montgomery, when he took command of the Eighth Army in August 1942, was already a controversial legend in the British Army. Boastful, ruthless with his subordinates, obsessive in planning, and opposed to the improvised style that had characterized Allied operations in Africa up to that point, Montgomery was not an easy man to like, but he was exactly what the situation required. From his very first week in command, Montgomery began rebuilding his troops' confidence. He banned any plans for retreat, going so far as to order the existing ones burned, reorganized the corps system, reinforced the role of infantry as the backbone of the defense, and began stockpiling reserves of armor, fuel, and ammunition with a meticulousness that would have driven Rommel to despair. He was, in every sense, the opposite of the desert fox. Cool where Rommel was impulsive, calculating where Rommel was intuitive, patient where Rommel was urgent. Rommel knew it, and he knew that time was working against him. With each passing week, the Eighth Army received more men, more tanks, and more aircraft from Britain and the United States. The Afrika Korps received comparatively far less. The figures spoke for themselves. In August 1942, the Eighth Army fielded 9 armoured brigades and 72 tank companies. The DK had 16. Italian troops supplemented the numbers, but their vehicles, the same 1940 models, completely outclassed by 1942, could not compare with the new Allied Grant, Sherman, and Valentine tanks. On August 30th, 1942, Rommel launched his final attack, the Battle of Alam Halfa. The plan followed the Desert Fox's classic formula: sweep around the southern flank of the Allied positions, cut north toward the sea, and envelop the Eighth Army in a pincer movement. He needed speed and surprise. He had neither. Montgomery, accurately informed by the Ultra-Cryptanalysis Service, which had been regularly deciphering German high command communications since 1941, knew exactly when and where Rommel would strike. He had reinforced the Alam Halfa Ridge with the 44th Infantry Division, heavy artillery, and deep minefields. When the German armoured columns attempted to turn north, they ran into a prepared defensive position, and battalions of Grant tanks firing at long range from static positions. The battle lasted 3 days. The Germans suffered considerable losses without breaking through the defensive line. Fuel, as always, was critical. Rommel had counted on capturing Allied depots to sustain his advance, but the depots had been destroyed or were out of reach. On September 3rd, the Afrika Korps began withdrawing toward the El Alamein lines. Rommel, ill and exhausted, returned to Europe to recover. Command passed to General Georg Stumme. The Battle of Alam Halfa was more than a tactical failure. It marked the recognition that the Afrika Korps had reached the absolute limit of its offensive capability. From that point on, the only possible strategy was defense, and in the desert, to defend was to die slowly. On October 23, 1942, at 21:40, the silence of the desert was suddenly shattered. More than 1,000 guns of the Eighth Army opened fire simultaneously on Axis positions. The roar could be heard 60 kilometers away. German and Italian defensive lines were engulfed in a curtain of fire and dust. The Second Battle of El Alamein had begun, the battle that would definitively change the course of the African campaign. The opposing forces were radically unequal. On the Axis side, 103,000 men, 49,000 Germans and 54,000 Italians, 548 tanks, 552 field guns, 1,063 anti-tank guns, 7,000 armed vehicles or half-tracks, and 350 aircraft. On the Allied side, 220,000 men, 1,230 tanks, more than 1,200 field guns, 1,451 anti-tank guns, 13,000 motorized vehicles, and 1,585 aircraft. The disparity in armor was more than 2 to 1, in aviation nearly 5 to 1. Rommel was not on the battlefield. He was in a sanatorium in Austria, recovering from digestive ailments and a drop in blood pressure that had left him out of action. When news of the attack arrived, he requested permission to return immediately. Hitler granted it. Rommel flew back to Africa on October 25th, but what he found upon landing was not the army he had left. General Stumme had died at the start of the battle on October 24th, when his command vehicle was hit by machine gun fire and his heart gave out under the strain of the attack. Temporary command had fallen to General Ritter von Thoma. German and Italian divisions were dug into a belt of mines 7 to 8 kilometers deep, more than 500,000 of them, interspersed with anti-personnel traps, camouflaged with sand and laid without any regular pattern. The British called this belt the Devil's Gardens. Montgomery's tactic was unlike anything any Allied general had attempted before. He was not seeking a battle of maneuver, he was seeking a battle of attrition. He knew that in terms of mobility and speed of reaction, the Germans were still superior, so he forced them to fight on fixed ground, without space for flanking maneuvers, consuming their reserves of men and tanks one by one. The front stretched 50 kilometers between the Mediterranean and the Qattara Depression. There was no room for the fox. The attack was carried out by infantry. 5 infantry divisions, British, Australian, New Zealander, South African and Indian, advanced in the darkness toward the minefields, each supported by a tank battalion and by air cover from the Desert Air Force. Engineers opened corridors through the mines, marking them with ropes while artillery suppressed forward defensive positions. It was a slow, methodical advance, brutally costly. Every kilometer was paid for in lives. Montgomery had his own moments of doubt. On October 26th, when tank regiments were suffering alarming losses trying to widen the breaches opened by the infantry, several of his divisional generals urged him to order a pause. Montgomery refused. He would later admit that he knew he had to give the order to continue. Even if the generals were not happy, the battle had to be decided, and it could only be decided by advancing. The Germans responded with desperate energy. Rommel, who had returned to command, coordinated counter-maneuvers from his forward command vehicle so close to the front that his own communications were repeatedly cut. He organized counterattacks with the last available panzers, but each counterattack consumed tanks that could not be replaced. The fuel situation was catastrophic. The Italian submarine Prosperina and the tanker Louisiano, loaded with fuel for the DAK, had been sunk by Allied aircraft in the Mediterranean in the days before the battle. The Afrika Korps began El Alamein with reserves for barely 7 days of intense operations. On the night of November 1st to 2nd, Montgomery launched Operation Supercharge, the final blow. The 2nd New Zealand Division and 2 armoured brigades attacked the weakest point in the Axis line, in the north, in a sector defended by Italian infantry divisions without tanks. Within hours, the breach was open. General Ritter von Thoma was captured on November 4th when his tank was destroyed, becoming the highest-ranking DAK officer to fall prisoner. That night, Rommel sent Hitler an urgent message. Defeat was imminent. The men needed to withdraw or die. Hitler replied with the order that would become a symbol of his misunderstanding of desert warfare, victory or death, not one step back. Rommel, for the first time in his life, directly disobeyed the Führer. On November 4, 1942, he ordered the general withdrawal of the Afrika Korps, contrary to Adolf Hitler's orders, later reports noted. It was the only sensible decision. It was also the end of the Egyptian adventure. While the Afrika Korps began its long withdrawal westward, a second blow struck the African theatre from an unexpected direction. Between November 8th and 16th, 1942, while Rommel was evacuating his positions at El Alamein, Anglo-American forces landed in Algeria and Morocco in Operation Torch. It was the largest amphibious landing of the war up to that point, and it placed the Afrika Korps in an inescapable position, pressured from the east by Montgomery's 8th Army, and from the west by the forces of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The Afrika Korps' retreat from El Alamein to Tunisia was one of the most remarkable withdrawal operations of the Second World War. Across 2,000 kilometers of coastline, under minimal fuel conditions and constant air pressure, DAC units maintained cohesion and order. Montgomery advanced cautiously, something his Allied peers would later criticize. But he was fast enough to deny the Germans any chance to reorganize. On January 23, 1943, the Eighth Army captured Tripoli. The city that had been the heart of the Afrika Korps, the port through which all supplies arrived, had fallen. But Rommel was not prepared to surrender without delivering one last blow, and his target was not the Eighth Army, which he knew too well, but the new enemy, the Americans. On February 14, 1943, the Afrika Korps launched an offensive through the Kasserine Pass in the Tunisian Atlas. The troops of the US Second Corps, inexperienced and poorly coordinated, took the attack head-on. The result was a humiliating defeat for the American army. In 2 days, German armored units advanced more than 80 kilometers into Tunisia, capturing hundreds of prisoners, destroying equipment, and sowing chaos in Allied communication lines. General Lloyd Fredendall, commander of the Second Corps, was relieved of his command as a direct consequence of the disaster. It was Rommel's last victory in Africa, and it was a victory he could not exploit. He had insufficient reserves, his supply lines were cut by Allied air power, and the Eighth Army was pressing from the east. The Feldmarschall ordered the consolidation of territorial gains and began preparing for the inevitable. On March 6, 1943, the Afrika Korps launched what would be its final offensive in the area of Medellin in southern Tunisia. It was a disaster. Montgomery had been informed in advance by Ultra of every detail of the attack, the timing, direction, and strength. Allied anti-tank divisions were waiting in position with 470 guns. The Afrika Korps lost 52 tanks in a matter of hours without breaching the defensive line. It was the cleanest and most costly defeat of the entire campaign. On March 9, 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was evacuated from Africa. Officially, the reason was medical. His health no longer allowed him to continue the campaign. In reality, it was recognition that the battle was lost. Rommel flew to Berlin, where he personally informed Hitler of the true situation in Tunisia. The Führer listened and refused to send him back to Africa. The Desert Fox would not return to the desert. Command of the Afrika Korps, now renamed Army Group Africa, fell to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who had arrived in Tunisia in late 1942 at the head of the 5th Panzer Army. Von Arnim was a competent officer, but he lacked Rommel's aura, and what remained in Tunisia was no longer the Afrika Korps of its glory days. It was exhausted, poorly supplied divisions trapped in a pocket that was closing in relentlessly. On May 13, 1943, at Cape Bon and in the last pockets of resistance scattered across northern Tunisia, the soldiers of the Afrika Korps and their Italian allies laid down their arms. The capitulation did not have the ceremony of major military endings. It was a mass surrender, carried out by units that had no escape, with no fuel to maneuver, no ammunition to fight, and no possibility of evacuation because the Mediterranean was completely dominated by the Royal Navy and Allied air power. The figures for the surrender are still debated among historians, but the most widely accepted estimates indicate that more than 230,000 Axis soldiers were taken prisoner. Some sources raise that number to 275,000, distributed between approximately 100,000 Germans and 175,000 Italians. Among the prisoners was General von Arnim, the last commander of Army Group Africa. The captured German soldiers would spend years in prisoner-of-war camps in Britain, the United States, and Canada. Churchill called the victory in Tunisia the African Stalingrad. The comparison was exaggerated in numerical terms. Stalingrad meant the surrender of 300,000 men of the German Sixth Army and shifted the global balance of the war, but in psychological terms the parallel was accurate. A major German force cornered, with no chance of rescue, destroyed in a geographic pocket with no exit. For Germany, it was the second major defeat in less than 6 months. Why did the Afrika Korps lose? The simple answer, Allied numerical superiority, is true but incomplete. A fuller explanation requires several levels. At the strategic level, Germany never considered the African theater a priority. For Hitler, the war was won or lost in the Soviet Union. The Afrika Korps was always a secondary force, fed with leftover resources after the needs of the Eastern Front had been met. While the African Panzer Army received 2 divisions, more than 200 operated in the Soviet Union. Strategic arithmetic never favored Rommel. At the operational level, the DAK was extraordinarily effective as long as it could fight on its own terms, fast, fluid, initiative-driven. When circumstances forced it onto the defensive, first at El Alamein, then in Tunisia, that advantage disappeared. The German army was not designed for defense. Its doctrine, training, and psychology were oriented toward the attack. Montgomery understood this and exploited it. He deprived Rommel of initiative and forced him to fight on fixed ground. At the tactical level, the Afrika Korps maintained genuine superiority for most of the campaign. Its soldiers were more aggressive, its officers made faster decisions, and its integration of armor, infantry, artillery, and tactical air support was more effective than that of the Allies for much of the conflict. It was only toward 1943, when the Americans and British began applying the lessons learned, that the tactical balance began to level out. Logistics was ultimately the decisive factor. General Auchinleck summarized it precisely in his memoirs. The African battle was essentially a contest of logistics. The Afrika Korps never had enough fuel, never enough ammunition, never enough spare parts. Convoys across the Mediterranean, systematically attacked by the Royal Navy and by air power from Malta, could not compensate for the imbalance. The island of Malta, which some German planners such as General Kurt Student had proposed capturing in Operation Hercules, was never taken, and that strategic omission had consequences that shaped the entire campaign. The Ultra-Intelligence Service added another layer to the imbalance. From late 1941 onward, the British regularly deciphered encrypted communications of the German High Command using Enigma machines, including Rommel's personal messages to Berlin and DAK situation reports. This meant that Montgomery, and Auchinleck before him, frequently knew German plans before they were executed. The precision with which the Eighth Army responded to the attacks at Alam Halfa and Medellin can only be explained by that advanced knowledge. Erwin Rommel returned to Europe in March 1943 and never went back to Africa. The man who had turned the North African desert into a globally celebrated theater of operations still had 18 months of war ahead of him, and the darkest of his career. His next assignment was the inspection of the Atlantic defenses in France, followed by command of Army Group B for the defense of Normandy. Rommel was convinced that the Allies would land and that they had to be destroyed on the beaches before they could consolidate their position. He argued passionately with Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt over defensive strategy. Once again, he was the man of initiative and immediate action, opposed to those who favored waiting and striking in depth. On July 17, 1944, Rommel's vehicle was attacked by Allied aircraft on a road near Livarot in Normandy. He suffered skull fractures and serious injuries. He was evacuated to Germany for recovery. Then came July 20, 1944. The assassination attempt on Hitler by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg and his fellow officers failed. The Gestapo investigation revealed links between some of the conspirators and Rommel. His name appeared in documents and recorded conversations as a possible head of state after the Führer's removal. Rommel denied having actively participated in the conspiracy. The evidence against him was indirect, and he himself stated that he had not known the plan included Hitler's assassination. He would have preferred capture and trial. However, he was too prominent a figure to ignore. On October 14, 1944, 2 generals of the army arrived at Rommel's house in Herlingen near Ulm, where the field marshal was recovering from his injuries. They offered him a choice: a trial before the People's Court, which would certainly condemn his family to disgrace and him to a public execution, or silent suicide with poison, which would be announced as death from his wounds and would guarantee him a state funeral with full honors. Rommel, then 52 years old, went out into the garden with his wife Lucy and his son Manfred, said goodbye to them, and got into the general's car. 20 minutes later, he was dead. The official cause was a collapse due to his previous injuries. Rommel's death was concealed for weeks. Berlin announced his passing with full honors for a field marshal fallen in combat. Hitler ordered a state funeral. Nothing was said about the poison pill. After the war, the truth gradually emerged. The testimonies of the officers present, the letters Rommel had left behind, and the research of writer Desmond Young, whose book Rommel became one of the earliest and most influential on the subject, reconstructed the events. The 1951 American film Rommel, The Desert Fox, starring James Mason, popularized the general's image in the post-war context, at a time when the United States needed to integrate West Germany into the defense of Europe and required respectable German figures to facilitate that process. Rommel, who had not been a member of the Nazi Party, who had ignored Hitler's order to execute captured commandos and British Indian troops, and whose connection to the anti-Nazi resistance was plausible, became the good German general, the apolitical professional, the desert knight. That image contains much truth and also some post-war construction. Rommel was a brilliant military commander and a complex human being who served a criminal regime loyally without directly associating himself with its most evident crimes. The African campaign, unlike the Eastern Front, was generally fought without mass civilian massacres, systematic executions of prisoners, or the industrial brutality that characterized the war of extermination in Poland and Russia. The Afrika Korps was an anomaly within the context of the Third Reich's war, a force that, with minor exceptions, operated within the norms of international law of the time. That gave it its distinctive aura, and that aura survived the defeat. To fully understand the Afrika Korps, one must also understand its great adversary, the British Eighth Army. Its soldiers, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Indians, Poles, Greeks, and of course the British, called themselves the Desert Rats, a nickname born from the insult the Nazi propaganda machine had hurled at them during the siege of Tobruk. Rats trapped in their burrows. The Australians adopted it as a badge of honor. The relationship between the Afrika Korps and the Eighth Army was unusual. It was a war without civilian populations directly involved, without partisans, without reprisals, and without the brutality that characterized other fronts. Prisoners were generally respected. Wounded enemies were treated whenever possible. Commanders on both sides privately, and sometimes publicly, expressed admiration for each other. Churchill praised Rommel in Parliament in January 1942. Rommel spoke respectfully of Australian tenacity at Tobruk. Montgomery, when asked about Rommel, responded with technical precision rather than personal insults. That relative chivalry turned the African campaign into something emotionally distinct from the war in the East or the Pacific. A soldier of the Afrika Korps captured at El Alamein knew he would survive. That changed the psychological calculus of surrender. The myth of the Afrika Korps as an invincible force was partly a deliberate construction of German propaganda under Goebbels. But it was also an unintended creation of Allied propaganda which needed to explain its defeats against a worthy and exceptional enemy. An army that loses to a genius suffers a more honorable defeat than one that loses to an equal. Rommel was, in that sense, the best gift Hitler could have given the British Empire, an enemy worth admiring. Bernard Montgomery understood that dynamic and actively rejected it. When Auchinleck, with dark humor, tried to attribute partial success to the Rommel factor, Montgomery replied coldly that such thinking was dangerous for morale. There were no mythical factors in war. There was planning, logistics, and willpower. The Eighth Army would win because it had more men, more tanks, and better supplies, and it would do so through methodical planning without heroic improvisation. Montgomery won El Alamein, and by doing so he changed the global perception of the war. For the first time since 1939, an Allied land army had defeated the Wehrmacht in open battle, not through overwhelming superiority in a single blow, but in a 12-day engagement against an enemy that fought skillfully in defense. On November 15, 1942, the bells of all churches in Britain rang out by order of Prime Minister Churchill. It was the first time they had done so since the war began. The question is inevitable, and historians have debated it for decades. If Rommel had had more resources, if Malta had fallen, if Hitler had prioritized the Mediterranean over the Caucasus, if supplies had arrived regularly, could the Afrika Korps have taken Alexandria, the Suez Canal, and changed the course of the war? Colonel Martinez de Merlon, in his comparative analysis of both armies, offers a nuanced answer. I don't really see it happening. We can say, well, maybe, but then what do I actually transfer to Egypt? The issue was not whether Rommel was sufficiently brilliant. He clearly was, but whether Germany had the strategic and logistical capacity to sustain an offensive of that scale on two simultaneous fronts. In July 1942, the Afrika Korps had approximately 60 operational tanks when it reached El Alamein. At that time, the German army had more than 200 divisions in the Soviet Union, launching Operation Blue toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad. Pulling armoured divisions from the Eastern Front to reinforce Rommel would have meant weakening an offensive Hitler considered decisive, and the Mediterranean theatre, with its enormous distances and dependence on the Italian navy, would have consumed those reinforcements just as quickly. Malta is the wild card in this debate. The island, located in the centre of the Mediterranean between Sicily and Tunisia, was the base from which Allied aircraft and submarines attacked Axis convoys. If Germany and Italy had carried out Operation Hercules, the planned invasion of Malta, scheduled for 1942 but cancelled after the fall of Tobruk, convoy losses would likely have been reduced. Rommel himself was convinced Malta was the key. "We have the Mediterranean in our hands, but we cannot close it," he wrote in his diary. But even with Malta, the fundamental problems of the campaign would have remained. The engine of the Afrika Korps was initiative and speed. Those virtues required fuel, and fuel required a logistical system that was never built at the scale the operation demanded. Italian forces, whose role in the overall logistics effort is often underestimated, did what they could. The problem was that what they had was not enough to sustain an advance to the Suez Canal, let alone defend it once captured. The most honest analysis is also the most sober. The Afrika Korps was the best army Germany could deploy to Africa given its commitments in the East. It achieved what it did because Rommel was exceptional and his soldiers fought with remarkable discipline and tactical initiative. But the strategic imbalance between what the Axis could sustain in the Mediterranean and what the Allies could sustain through their Atlantic and Indian Ocean supply lines was ultimately unbridgeable. The industrial and logistical machinery of the United States, which began to make itself felt from late 1942 onward, had no equivalent within the Axis system. As Montgomery said at the end of the campaign, "Victory in battle is the task of the general. Victory in war is the task of the statesman." The Allied statesmen built the conditions for victory. The Allied generals ultimately executed it.